The desert looks empty. No forests. No rivers. No cities for hundreds of miles. Just sand, rocks, heat, and an endless horizon. But during World War II, this seemingly empty landscape became one of the most important battlefields on Earth. Thousands of soldiers crossed the desert in tanks and trucks, searching for their enemy. And there was one thing that made desert warfare completely different from fighting anywhere else. You could see your enemy coming from miles away. But that didn't mean you could stop them. In North Africa, armies had to fight not only each other, but also the environment itself. Extreme heat could destroy equipment. Sand could stop vehicles. Water became more valuable than almost anything else. And supply lines stretched hundreds of miles behind the front. For commanders, winning a battle wasn't simply about having more soldiers. It was about knowing where the enemy was, knowing where your supplies were, and knowing how long your army could survive in the middle of nowhere. One of the most famous commanders of the campaign was Erwin Rommel, often called the Desert Fox. Rommel became known for moving quickly and attacking when his opponents least expected it. Instead of simply pushing forward with overwhelming numbers, his forces often relied on speed, deception, and surprise. But there was a problem. The desert was enormous. Every kilometer forward meant another kilometer of supplies that had to be transported. Fuel, food, water, ammunition, spare parts. Everything had to travel across the desert. And this created one of the biggest problems of the entire campaign. An army could win a battle, and still lose the war because it couldn't keep its soldiers supplied. The British forces faced the same problem. They had to defend important positions while trying to stop Axis forces from advancing farther east. The fighting became a constant struggle of movement and counter-movement. One side would advance. The other would retreat. Then the situation would suddenly reverse. And because the battlefield was so open, commanders often had to rely heavily on reconnaissance. Finding the enemy before the enemy found you could completely change the outcome of a battle. But the desert had another surprise. The battlefield wasn't always where the commanders expected it to be. Sandstorms could reduce visibility. Vehicles could break down far from support. And a force that looked powerful on paper could become dangerously vulnerable if it moved too far away from its supply bases. As the campaign continued, the Allies began improving their organization and intelligence. They learned more about enemy movements. They improved logistics. And they became better at coordinating large formations. Eventually, the balance began to shift. The desert that had once offered opportunities for rapid attacks became increasingly difficult for Axis forces to control. By 1942, the North African campaign reached a decisive stage. At El Alamein, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery faced Rommel's army. The battle would become one of the major turning points of the war in North Africa. The British had prepared carefully. They had superior resources and increasingly strong logistical support. The battle was difficult and costly. But the result forced Axis forces into a retreat. And this retreat would continue across North Africa. Eventually, Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Axis forces were now trapped between armies advancing from different directions. In May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The desert campaign was over. But its lessons would remain. North Africa showed that modern warfare wasn't only about soldiers and weapons. It was also about fuel, transportation, information, planning, and logistics. A commander could win an impressive battle and still lose the entire campaign. Because in the desert, there was nowhere to hide from the biggest enemy of all: distance. The North African campaign remains one of the most fascinating chapters of World War II. Not because the desert was easy to conquer, but because the desert made every mistake more expensive. And in a place where every drop of water and every liter of fuel mattered, sometimes the army that could survive the longest was the army that ultimately won.